Now let's get back to making huge numbers with our new flexibility in creating gadgets for the control slot. So we had barely gotten to omega naught times 4 as a control. Remember, this is our new name for F, the standard base level fast growing hierarchy. And so we want to do it sort of more systematically, create groovy stuff here. And we've really been doing this already, right? So this is, if we think about omega naught plus 1 was really the absolute simplest use of the phi1 function creator. And so phi1 you just want to think of as the same thing as phi naught, the same thing as the fast growing hierarchy, but just in a one higher level up context. So that's just the 0 version of that applied to omega naught. Okay, that's just obviously overcomplicating things a little bit, right? Now this is omega naught plus 2. That is, take the 0th level phi1 function, iterate it twice on omega naught, and then eventually apply it to n. Phi naught omega naught 2, that was our first new function-y gadget after omega naught. Well, that is phi1 of 1 omega naught. Right? So phi, if you just think of this as f of 1 blah should be doubling blah. And we've talked about how there's such exactly a precise notion of doubling, and that's omega naught 2. And then omega naught 4, that's about as far as we've gotten. That would be if you double twice on omega naught. So we could certainly go just a tiny bit further and unpack things relatively explicitly, and it would be instructive, but I don't want to get too extreme about the huge expansions that fill the screen yet. Well, what about if I don't double just once or twice or 3 times or 4 times? What if I double omega naught times? And now that's going to be something that's going to need to be unpacked, but we'll unpack that really, really quickly. And why is that such a good thing to look at next? It's because that is the one version of the phi1 function, iterated omega naught times on omega naught. That's exactly what phi1 of 2 omega naught should be. Right? So this is our first new thing that comes out of our discussion, that it really does make sense to do this kind of stuff. It makes sense to iterate something like doubling a function number of times. So what the heck does that mean? Okay, so I am going to be looking at, start with our sort of most basic function, omega naught. We're going to do some low level, but not trivial, fast growing hierarchy type of arithmetic on that, which is what the phi1 does, with the 2 meaning low level. That creates a new function, or new control gadget that I then feed into phi naught to tell phi naught which function are you going to emulate, are you going to unpack. And then let's see what happens with 1. We should get a degenerate answer, but let's just see what happens. And I think it's still instructive to do this once in a while. Okay, so by definition, the 2 version of phi1 is supposed to be the iteration of the 1 version of phi1, where the exponent, the first thing I do is that exponent is supposed to match the input value. Now, that is begging for a number input. Well, okay, it's in a context where it's going to get a number input. Because remember, what's the general idea? Phi naught of alpha comma n. This is the basic idea of diagonalization that we're using. And that is of alpha of n comma n. Okay, so this is why this function iteration stuff is really natural in this context. I want to keep feeding this input. When it's 1, it's going to be kind of dorky, but I want to keep feeding this input into various openings in the control gadget. And so it's totally natural that it says, oh, that's what I'm supposed to feed that into. And so we're going to take that 1. This is just saying we're going to feed it into the control gadget, and then we know, what does that iteration mean? It means feed the 1 into the omega naught, and feeding a 1 into omega naught just gives you the number 1. Okay, that's kind of silly. I'm just doubling this once, so I'm not really iterating it in a very complicated way. I don't think I need those parentheses. Okay, so that's phi naught of omega naught 2, to use a little bit different notation. All right, now that's again a function. Well, this one is just waiting here saying, hey, anytime you want me to give my input, I'm ready. We diagonalize again. Okay, by definition, that's omega naught plus 1. That is again an iteration, but now it's an iteration of the phi naught. So that's phi naught on the omega naught level, iterated just once, which is phi naught of omega naught 1, which is phi 1 of 1, which is 2. So all that work just to get the measly number 2. Okay, let's do it with 2 and see what happens there. Gonna be not so degenerate. Okay, so we set it up, just putting a 2 in here. And now, okay, this is the same thing, exactly as before. We're just unpacking what does the 2 level of phi 1 do. It's iterated 1 level of phi 1. And let me just abbreviate that. That's just D iterated omega naught times. So we still got that omega naught in the iteration exponent, but the very next thing we do is the 2 from here feeds into the control slot. As soon as it's in the control slot, it asks where to go. And if you're an iterator, if it's an iterated thing, it has to go into the iteration exponent. So that's D twice. And we've been saying that, another way to write that is omega naught 4. That's still a function. How does that unpack? It's omega naught 3 plus omega naught. And that omega naught gets the 2. So that's the fancy way to say that is that's omega naught eating a 2. But because omega naught is so special, it's the identity function, it just degenerates into just the number 2. Okay, this is still no slouch. This is basically right where we were, where we kind of left off. This is take the omega naught 3 plus 1 level function and apply it twice to 2. And we've seen that that is pretty freaking huge. Let's call O phi naught of omega naught 3 plus 1 with a 2 input. Let's just call that n. That's a really honking big number, even though it's just using input 2. And then we're going to take phi naught again at the omega naught 3 plus 1 level, and we're going to iterate it n times on n. Okay, what is n? So to have any idea how big this is, we certainly still first need to look at, well, how big is n? And again, this is something we saw before. We're going to kind of dive into the iteration exponent. This is going to be, if n's big, this is going to be big for 3 reasons. The least important is the n here, the input thing. The next most important, much more important, is the fact that a big number is in the iteration slot. And then that combined with the fact that this is the kind of function, is incredibly fast growing function, that means if you iterate it and you recycle outputs to inputs a lot of times, it's going to give a shockingly big answer. So all that leads to the first step being just like, okay, this is less ambitious than just trying to understand this at one fell swoop, but at least let's understand the n, mainly because of its presence in the iteration exponent. Okay, what is that? Omega naught 3 plus 1 evaluated at 2. That's not too bad when you first expand it. It's this omega naught 3 gadget done twice. Okay, but what's the omega naught 3 gadget? It's omega naught 2 plus an omega naught, which is a diagonalizer slot. So that omega naught immediately just takes whatever the heck that number is and puts it in as a number of successors on an omega naught 2. Okay. And while I'm at it, why don't I go ahead and do the same kind of diagonalization on this guy? That's omega naught 2 plus 2 with a 2 input. And same deal here, it's the same thing. Okay, now we can start to see again how these expansions start to go. And some of these expansions are going to get kind of crazy. At the risk of not being as readable, I'm going to go down a little bit on the size here because I want to be able to fit things on one line for a little while longer. Okay, what the heck is this? Let's just go ahead and expand this a little bit. An omega naught 2 plus 2 with a 2 input. That is, repeat the phi naught omega naught 2 plus 1 twice. So I'm going ahead and expanding that in both the places it shows up. Okay, well, let's see. Let's just look at this one. This is the phi naught with an omega naught 2 plus 1 input on something. Let's just not worry about that for a minute. That means we iterate the phi naught of omega naught 2 with an arbitrary input. that something many times. So this iteration exponent exactly matches the original input, okay? And I'm doing the same expansion over here just to show, even though this is the somewhat less important spot, because it's the input and as opposed to the control, it's still kind of meaningful that that's growing as well, or expanding as well. Okay, but wait a sec. If we go into this iteration exponent, remember, we're already looking at an iteration exponent. Theoretically, we should just become incredibly confident about our knowledge of this whole mess, and then go back and say, oh, the whole point was that that's the iteration exponent and the input in this level of function repeated incredibly many times. Well, we're probably not going to do that. But let's see. Now we're diving again into an iteration exponent, and we're getting phi naught, and now it's the omega naught 2 level repeated twice to get the iteration exponent on how many times this super powerful function is applied to this pretty big input. And that's how many successors we put on an omega naught 2 level gadget and put that into a phi naught with a big input. And then that's how many times we iterate this whole function. And to be honest, this was at the very, very edge of our understanding. We really don't have some incredibly great grasp of just how powerful this function is. And now we're using these incredibly big, almost as sophisticated techniques to create this number, which is then how many times repeat this incredibly powerful function. That's how this goes. Let's see. Let's just dive into a tiny bit again. Again, like the fractal, you don't understand the entire Mandelbrot set by diving into a tiny little seahorse or something, but it's still fun. I think it's fun. And I know that those usually come with music, and this doesn't have cool background music, but yeah, so I'm low tech. Oh well. So what about this little guy, right? So we go into the iteration exponent of this part of the expression, and we just go into one little part of that. Phi naught of omega naught 2, 2. Okay, this is something that's not crazy huge. Well, it is crazy huge by any normal standard. But once again, that just unpacks as phi naught of omega naught plus 2, 2. That's one we actually did in some detail. It says first calculate F88, blow away 99.9% of the people you've ever met by even trying to understand that, pretend we understand it, use that as the iteration count in an F omega naught, which is still a pretty powerful gadget. That is this little tiny bit. And then you do an omega naught 2 level on that again. And then that's the iteration exponent on another omega naught 2 level. And then finally, you've got the number of successors. That is a number. This whole thing is a non-negative integer. It's a very large positive integer. And that's the iteration exponent on that guy. Whew. Okay. It's just the starting seed to calculate the n, which was just a part of the calculation that we had before. Okay. Let's see. Let's go a little further. So let's just be really bold and just say the function that's showing up more than any other here is the omega naught 2 level of phi naught or f. And that's pretty darn big. That's getting into some, I think it's like Conway 4 chains or something. If you know about Conway chains, I can't remember it. I have to look it up. But pretty powerful, way beyond Graham's number. But let's just pretend we understand it and call it f, because if you give it a one-letter name, you can pretend you understand something. Great principle. Okay. So remember, n is this guy. So let's just abbreviate it. This could be convenient so it doesn't fill the page. But you have to remember, it's a massive cheat, because this is not something that's really humanly comprehensible. But let's say modulo that. Like in computer science, they say they have oracles and stuff. Let's say we have an oracle who gives us this, or more generally, like, grants us the power to completely understand and really comprehend f, which is not really going to happen for any human. But let's pretend that's true. Then this is the most succinct way to write n. It says take f of n. Let's see, I wrote it out here, right? we're using f of m. Oh yeah, and m, little m, that was this guy. So we're assuming that this guy's like, oh, that's easy to understand. No worries. That's so tiny, right? So we now put that into f, which we're pretending is not a huge function, but it is. Okay. And we use that as an iteration exponent on f itself with input f of m. And then that's the input slot. Okay. Then in the more sensitive slot, we do the same exact calculation. And that's the number of successors we add on to omega naught 2. And so if we think we understand this f function, then we're going to be maybe sort of pretend we understand f of omega naught 2 plus 1, and f of omega naught 2 plus 2 is going to get pretty scary big, and we're going to repeat that successor process so many times, right? And when I think about it, it's like the number of recursion diagonalization cycles to apply, I guess what I say is 2f, and that's just this enormous number. That's just to get n, and then that's what we use to iterate this much more powerful function on within input itself. Okay, and what is that? That unpacks with many, 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 many applications of phi naught omega naught 3, and each of those will turn into these a lot more omega naught 2 plus m's. Those m's are going to make this incredibly large n look ridiculously small because they created out of repeated process of this guy starting on n and getting much, much, much bigger. So that is pretty crazy big. Good place to stop this one.